The desert stretched like a wound beneath the dying sun, a flat expanse of bone-dry earth that shimmered with heat even as the day surrendered to night. Wind slithered across the sand, lifting ghostly veils of dust, whispering secrets of men who had bled and fallen here long before. A rider swayed in the saddle, his body slack with exhaustion. His horse was no better. Hide foamed with sweat, flanks streaked with dirt, hooves dragging as if each step might be his last. The outlaw's coat was torn open at the side, dark with blood that had long since caked into the fabric. Every breath was a knife in his chest. He gripped the saddle horn only to keep from spilling to the ground, his head heavy with fever, and the ringing echo of gunfire still trapped in memory. He had been running for days, chased not just by the law's iron hand, but by the weight of choices that could never be undone. When the horse stumbled to its knees, he slid off, boots sinking into hot dust. The animal trembled, then sagged against the earth. He stood there for a long moment, staring at it as though deciding whether mercy or survival mattered more. But mercy won out. With shaking hands, he slipped the bridle free and patted the horse's neck. The creature bolted weakly into the darkening expanse, disappearing as quickly as all things in the desert eventually did. The town appeared like a mirage, crouched low on the horizon, its buildings leaning with the weight of too many storms. Faint lamplight glowed through broken shutters. A church steeple rose crooked against the violet sky, its bell long silent. Each step tore at carved agony through his ribs, but he pressed on, guided by hunger, desperation, and the small ember of stubborn will that refused to let him fall. By the time he staggered into the alley behind the church, night had folded across the land. The outlaw braced against the wall, his vision swimming, then collapsed onto the dirt. Dust rose around him, catching in his throat. He closed his eyes, prepared to let the desert claim him at last. It might have ended there if not for the sound of soft footsteps and the flick of a lantern being raised. A woman stood in the glow, her figure outlined against the shadows of the alley. She did not scream or call for the sheriff, though her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Instead, she crouched beside him, the lantern's flame casting both their faces in an intimate circle of light. "You're bleeding," she said, voice steady, not frightened. Her hands were calloused, marked by work. She touched his side without hesitation, as though life and death were things she had met before and no longer feared. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw with thirst. A rasp was all he managed. She lifted his arm over her shoulder, surprisingly strong for a frame, and half carried him into a small house tucked near the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled faintly of herbs and smoke. The home was plain but cared for, its walls bearing the marks of years gone by. A table stood beneath a window, covered with scattering of sewing thread, a chipped cup, and a Bible whose pages curled at the edges. A single child's toy lay forgotten in the corner, wood worn smooth from use. She lowered him onto a bed. The sheets were rough, yet softer than the desert earth. Without a word, she fetched water and cloth, dabbing away the dirt and blood. He flinched when she pressed a rag to the wound, but she did not falter. Candlelight shimmered across her face, showing a woman carved by hardship but not broken by it. He studied her in silence, tried to gauge what kind of fool she might be. She should have left him to die in the street. Instead, she poured water between his lips, steadying his hand when it trembled. "You'll live," she murmured, though he heard no certainty in the words, only resolve. When he finally found voice, it came as a whisper. "You don't even know my name." Her eyes held his, steady and unflinching. "Doesn't matter. You're here and you're bleeding. That's enough." He turned his face away, unwilling to let gratitude show. Names were dangerous things, binding as rope. Still, her kindness cut deeper than any bullet. Outside, the night swelled with sound. Dogs barking, a saloon piano clanging faintly through the heat-thick air. Somewhere farther off, hoofbeats echoed, low and deliberate. He tensed, instinct sharp despite the pain. She must have seen the way his hand moved toward where his gun would have been if it hadn't slipped from his grasp hours ago. "You're not safe here, are you?" she asked, though it sounded more like fact than question. He didn't answer, but silence spoke well enough. She dipped the cloth back into the bowl, wringing it out with firm hands. "Men like you bring trouble. Always." Her words should have cut him, but there was no cruelty in them, only weary knowledge. He let his eyes close for a moment, listening to the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind rattling the shutters. He knew she was right. Trouble followed him the way shadow followed light. When he woke again, hours later, moonlight poured silver across the room. She sat in a chair near the bed, lantern extinguished, hands folded as though she had been waiting. For a brief instant, the outlaw felt a strange sense of peace, fragile and foreign. Yet beyond the walls of that small home, the desert still stretched wide and merciless, and men with iron badges or heavier purses were closing in. He could almost hear their voices in the distance, sharp with promise, justice, vengeance, coin. The outlaw breathed against the ache in his ribs, tasting blood and dust. He was alive, though he could not yet say why. But in the silence between them, with her eyes fixed on him not with fear, but with unspoken questions, he felt the first stirrings of something he had not known in years, something more dangerous than any gun aimed his way. And as the night deepened, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavier on his chest than the wound ever could. The mornings came slow in the desert town, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over weathered wood and dust-bitten streets. He woke to the scrape of a chair, the woman moving quietly across the room. She had left bread on the table, a small gesture, yet more than he expected. His side burned when he tried to sit, but the pain was cleaner now, less suffocating than before. He ate in silence, feeling her eyes on him, though she never asked questions while he chewed. By the third day, he could stand on his own. He pushed open the door to the porch and felt the dawn settle over him. Skies streaked in pale pink, air cool before the heat returned. She found him there, leaning on the railing like a man learning the shape of stillness. Without asking, she handed him a hammer and pointed to the loose plank on the porch. He hesitated, but then bent to the task, nails clutched in rough fingers. The rhythm steadied him, the act of fixing something instead of breaking it. She watched for a moment before moving on to feed the chickens. Work became his language with her. He mended a fence, chopped wood, carried water. She rarely thanked him, but there was a shift in the air, the smallest thread binding them through labor. Sometimes their eyes met when he passed her a tool, and though no words followed, the silence between them softened. He noticed a faint scar along her wrist, the way her mouth tightened when certain townsfolk passed by. There was a history in her just as there was in him, though neither dared to speak it outright. One evening, as dusk melted into night, they shared a meal at her table. The stew was thin but warm. He broke the bread in half and slid the larger piece across to her. She looked at him as though trying to read what kind of man offered such a gesture. "You don't talk much," she said at last. "Talking's what gets a man noticed," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. She considered that, eyes narrowing, or it keeps him honest. Her words held weight, though she didn't press him further. He knew she wanted to ask why he was here, what sins had driven him to bleed on her doorstep. But she held her questions back, as though she already suspected the answers might not matter. That night a storm came suddenly, rolling across the desert with winds sharp as knives. Rain hammered the shutters, lightning cutting the sky open. He rose to help her fasten the windows, both of them moving quickly in the flicker of candlelight. At one window, their hands collided as they reached for the latch. She didn't pull away, and neither did he. The storm outside seemed to pause, leaving only the sound of their breaths mingling in the close dark. For a moment he thought of leaning closer, thought of forgetting the trail of men and blood that followed him. But he stepped back instead, retreating to the far side of the room where shadows had the look on his face. When the storm passed, the air smelled of wet earth, heavy and alive. He lay awake, listening to her breathe in the chair across from him. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar. He had known desire before, fleeting and cruel, but this was different. This was fragile, something that demanded care he was not sure he could give. He feared it more than the lawmen that stalked his trail. Days folded together. He found himself lingering in moments he knew he should avoid. The curve of her smile when she spoke to a neighbor, the quiet hum she made while mending clothes, the way she tilted her head when listening, as if every word mattered. She carried grief. He could see it, but she carried it with a strength that steadied him more than whiskey or prayer ever had. One night, when the fire burned low, she finally asked, "How long do you think you can stay hidden?" His jaw tightened. He stared into the flames as if the answer lay inside them. "Long as I have to." "That's not forever," she said. Her tone was not sharp, but heavy with truth. Men are asking questions in town. Folks notice a stranger. "I'll be gone before they come knocking," he muttered, though the thought of leaving twisted something in him. She studied him for a long while. "And if you don't?" "If they come first." He looked at her then, the flickering light drawing shadows across her face. "Then I do what I've always done." His voice was low, edged with steel, but behind it lay the weariness of a man who had grown tired of running. The silence that followed pressed heavy on both of them. He saw the fear she tried to hide, not of him, but of the trouble clinging to his heels. She was not naive. She knew the risk of sheltering a hunted man, yet she stayed, and that choice bound them closer than either admitted. The following afternoon, he overheard voices outside the saloon while fetching water. Rough men spoke of a bounty, of riders spotted heading their way. His chest grew tight, and he slipped back through the alleys like a shadow. She was in the yard when he returned, hanging wash linens in the sun. He told her what he heard, words clipped. Her hand still on the clothespin, eyes darting toward the hills beyond town. "They'll come," she whispered. He nodded. "Soon." Her lips parted as if to speak, but she only pressed her jaw shut and returned to her work. The fabric whipped in the wind, snapping like flags of surrender. He watched her in silence, the weight of what he owed her growing heavier with each heartbeat. That night, sleep did not come easily. He sat by the window, watching the horizon where the moonlight spilled silver over the desert. His thoughts circled like vultures, choices made, roads taken, and the fleeting tenderness he had found in her presence. He had no right to it, no claim, and yet he could not turn from it. The air shifted, and he knew she was awake too. She stood behind him in the half-dark, her voice quiet as falling ash. "You can't keep outrunning the world." He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "Maybe not, but for now, I can hold it off." She stepped closer, so near he could see the reflection of the moon in her eyes. Something passed between them, wordless but certain, a promise neither dared name. The night seemed to hold its breath. He wanted to reach for her, to anchor himself in that fragile moment, but the sound of distant hoofbeats carried on the wind, faint yet undeniable. They froze, listening. The riders were still far, but moving closer. He felt the old weight return, heavy and inevitable. He knew then that time was narrowing around them, that whatever had begun between them lived under the shadow of pursuit. Yet, when she placed a hand on his arm, he did not pull away. For the first time in years, he felt not only hunted, but human, and though danger pressed nearer with each passing night, he let the moment linger, a fragile defiance against the storm already rising on the horizon. The days that followed felt stolen, each moment edged with a tension neither of them spoke aloud. He rose early, working in the yard before the sun could punish the earth, while she tended to the small garden that clung stubbornly to life near her porch. They moved around each other with a rhythm that grew natural, unspoken, as though they had lived this way for years instead of weeks. Sometimes, when their hands brushed or their eyes lingered too long, silence swelled heavy between them, carrying everything they dared not say. In town, whispers gathered like storm clouds. The saloon kept its doors open late, the air thick with smoke and suspicion. Men with empty pockets and sharp eyes began to wonder about the stranger who never showed his face in daylight. The sheriff himself watched the house from across the street one afternoon, his hand hovering near the butt of his revolver as though waiting for an excuse. She noticed, but said nothing. He noticed, too, and the guilt gnawed at him harder than the wound in his side. One evening, while she mended a shirt by the fire, he sat at the table with his hands folded, restless. "You should tell me to leave," he said at last. The words dragged from him like stones. She glanced up, needle paused mid-stitch. "If I wanted you gone, you wouldn't be sitting here. That's not the same thing." His voice was low, tight with unease. "I brought danger to your door. It's only a matter of time before it finds you." Her eyes met his across the flickering glow. Maybe danger was already here. Maybe it just wears different faces. The truth of her words unsettled him. He thought of the way the townsfolk looked at her. Pity mixed with suspicion. A widow left alone in a hard land was already a target, whether she offered shelter to an outlaw or not. He wanted to tell her she deserved more than this weight, more than him. But the words withered in his throat. The tension in town thickened. A pair of bounty hunters rode in, their horses restless, their eyes colder than the desert night. They asked questions in the saloon, their voices carrying to the cracked doors. Tall man, rough coat, wounded, pays to keep your eyes sharp. A few heads turned toward the church end of town, where the woman's house stood. He heard about it later, from a boy who ran messages for pennies and carried gossip faster than the wind. That night, he sat in the darkened attic above her bed, pistol in hand, watching the street. She had insisted he stay out of sight, though she never asked what he would do if they came. He thought about it anyway, his finger brushing the worn grip of the revolver. Every choice narrowed into violence. Yet when he looked down at her sleeping, the rise and fall of her chest steady despite the storm gathering outside, he felt something shift inside him, something that ached not to destroy but to protect. The bounty hunters made their move 2 days later. They knocked at doors heavy-fisted, rattling windows with their questions. The sheriff pretended not to see, letting them do what lawmen often did when coin was louder than justice. By the time they reached her porch, the town was holding its breath. She opened the door with calm eyes, lantern steady in her hand. One of the hunters leaned close, his breath sour with whiskey. Stranger passed through here? Tall, dark hair, scar near his jaw. Pays good if he points the right way. Her voice never trembled. Ain't seen anyone but the folks who belong here. The man studied her, suspicion curdling into a smile that was more threat than charm. He stepped closer, eyes flicking past her shoulder into the shadows of the house. For an instant, he might have forced his way in, but she lifted her chin, jaw set like iron, and the hunter hesitated. Something in her gaze warned him he'd be walking into more than he bargained for. With a curse, he spat to the ground and turned away. From the attic, the outlaw had watched it all, blood pounding in his ears. His hand had hovered over the pistol, every instinct demanding he put an end to it. Yet he stayed still, knowing the shot would bring the whole town running. When the riders finally left the porch, his breath left him in a ragged rush. He realized then that she had risked herself for him, lied cleanly without a second's hesitation. Later, when the danger had passed, he came down the narrow ladder, face pale with rage and gratitude mixed. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "And if I hadn't?" she asked softly, setting the lantern aside. "What then?" He had no answer, only a storm of feeling he couldn't name. He reached for her without thinking, hand brushing her arm. The contact burned hotter than any bullet wound. She didn't pull away. For the briefest moment, the air between them broke, their hearts exposed in the silence. Then she stepped back, her eyes shining with a grief he didn't yet understand. He turned away, fists clenched. He had built his life on running, on never belonging to anything but the road. Now, for the first time, he wanted to stay, yet the sound of hoofbeats still echoed in his ears, growing louder with each nightfall. He knew the bounty hunters would return, and next time they would not be satisfied with words. As the fire burned low, he cleaned his gun slowly, the weight of it heavy in his hands. She watched him from across the room, her face unreadable, though he sensed the same question circling her thoughts as it did his. How much longer could this fragile piece survive? The answer seemed written in the night beyond the window. He thought he saw movement on the ridge, dark shapes against the horizon, waiting. He told himself it was only shadows. But deep down, he knew the circle was closing. Still, when he lay down that night, her presence close enough to feel in the quiet, he allowed himself a dangerous thought, that maybe even hunted men could dream of something worth the risk. It was a fragile hope, but he clung to it as the desert wind carried the sound of riders drawing nearer. The night was restless, the air thick with a silence that felt unnatural. He stood at the window, every muscle alert, while the woman moved about the dimly lit room gathering what little she thought they might need if they had to leave quickly. Neither spoke, Yet both knew words were useless now. The hoofbeats he had feared were no longer distant. They came steady, measured, the sound of men who knew what they hunted. By the time the first shadow crossed her porch, he already had his revolver drawn. The door shuddered under a heavy fist, the voice on the other side sharp with command. "Open up. No use hiding him." She froze where she stood, eyes locked to his. In them he saw no fear for herself, only for him. He shook his head once, signaling her to stay back, then positioned himself by the door. When it splintered inward, the room erupted. Lantern light flared. Men spilled inside with pistols raised, and in the chaos he fired first. The crack of gunfire shattered the silence, smoke filling the air as glass burst and was splintered. She ducked low behind the table, clutching the edge while bullets tore through the walls. He moved like a man who had rehearsed this dance too many times, swift and grim, his body turning with each shot, his face set with determination rather than fury. 2 men fell before the others retreated to reload, shouting to one another over the chaos. The house itself seemed to cry out, flames licking at a curtain where a lantern had overturned. He grabbed her hand, dragging her through the back door as the blaze caught. The night air was sharp with gunpowder and smoke. Townsfolk had gathered at a distance, some peering from windows, others clutching rifles but too frightened to intervene. The bounty hunters cursed and regrouped, their boots striking hard against the dirt as they followed. They ran together through the back alleys, slipping between buildings until the open desert stretched before them. The moon was high, silvering the sand, the wind carrying grit that stung their faces. Behind them, voices drew nearer, relentless. She stumbled once, and he steadied her, his hand firm at her waist. "Keep going," he muttered, though his own breath came ragged. They reached the canyon's edge, its stone walls rising like teeth against the night. There he slowed, knowing they had reached the end of their flight. She turned to him, her chest heaving. "We can still run. There has to be another way." He shook his head, eyes fixed on the dark ridge where riders approached. "No, they won't stop. Not while I'm breathing." His voice softened, breaking in a way she had never heard. "You gave me more than I ever deserved. Let me give you this." Her hand caught his arm, fierce with refusal. "Don't you dare leave me with nothing but ghosts." For a moment, he almost faltered, but the sound of approaching hooves sealed his resolve. He leaned close, pressing his forehead to hers. The world fell away until there was only her breath, her warmth. "I found something worth dying for," he whispered, then stepped back before she could stop him. He strode into the canyon's mouth, revolver in hand, shoulders squared against the odds. The bounty hunters spread out, their torches casting monstrous shadows against the stone. The leader rode forward, voice dripping with satisfaction. "End of the line, boy. You've run long enough." The outlaw raised his gun without a word. The exchange was brutal, thunderous shots echoing off the canyon walls, dust rising in clouds around them. He moved with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, each shot precise, each step driving forward. One by one, men fell, cries cut short in the roar of gunfire. Yet numbers weighed heavy, and soon his body staggered under the impact of a bullet tearing into his shoulder, another grazing his leg. Still he fought, forcing them back until the leader remained, snarling, firing wild. They stood across from each other in a haze of smoke, 2 men bound by violence and inevitability. The outlaw's hand trembled, blood soaking his shirt, but his aim held true. His final shot rang out, striking the bounty hunter square in the chest. The man toppled from his horse, the sound of his fall swallowed by the night. Silence followed, broken only by the wind. The surviving riders, shaken and leaderless, cursed and scattered into dark, unwilling to test fate further. The outlaw dropped to his knees, revolver slipping from his grasp, breath shallow. She was at his side in an instant, catching him as he fell. Blood stained her hands as she cradled him, her tears falling hot against his face. "Stay with me," she begged, voice cracking. His eyes found hers, weary yet softened with a peace she had never seen in him before. "No more running," he murmured. His hand brushed weakly against her cheek, then stilled. "You were the only thing that made it right." She pressed her forehead to his, sobbing against a truth she could not stop. The first light of dawn touched the canyon, painting the desert gold. She sat with him until the sun rose fully, the silence around them heavy with both loss and defiance. By morning, she dug into the earth with her bare hands, laying him to rest beneath the endless sky. Townsfolk gathered at a distance, uncertain whether to condemn or honor what they saw. She ignored them all, her grief private, her strength unshaken. When the last stone was placed upon the mound, she stood, dust clinging to her dress, eyes set toward the horizon. The law had taken her husband, the bounty men had taken the outlaw, but they had not taken her will. She would endure, carrying his memory like a hidden flame. The wind swept through the canyon, whispering across the land, carried with the final echo of a man who had once been only an outlaw, and in the end had found his angel.